Hey everyone, Card Cafe here, ready to bring you some set 12 goodness. It is here. Set 11 I feel like just dropped, but here we are. Love the release schedule. Bushy, it makes a whole lot of sense, but I can't complain too much. Set 12 brought us some really cool decks that I am personally having a lot of fun with, and we're going to start with my favorite of them, which is the Ominagruzio Evil Eye Masque deck. In my opinion, the most consistent of the mask decks that are currently out. Maybe not the best mask deck, because Zorga's still running around, but I think this one's a lot of fun, and it is very consistent. Normally I only show off one card, but with this deck as we go through, you'll see the original card for Ominagruzio, the one that's not the mask, it's a cool card, but like this card's the real show. And they just work in tandem with each other. So we gotta show off both at the same time. But getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, first let's talk about this really fun ride line that we got going on. The kitty cats that, I guess, Digivolve or Pokemon Evolve, depending on your fan base choice. But you got the Evil Eye Kitty here at the bottom. The grade 0 that says just what all the other starters say. If you're going second, ride on it, draw a card. All good. But then we got the Evil Eye Crow here at the grade 1 spot. Now, this card's cool because it is an axe skill. Unlike a lot of the other grade 1 lands where it's either when rode upon or when he rides, this is an axe. So you can set some other things up first, which is important for certain combos that we'll talk about in a little bit. But his skill is, you Soul Blast 1, and you check the top 5 cards of your deck for a card with Ominagruzio in its name. I'm probably butchering that. Sidebar, just get that out of the way. That's almost certainly not how you pronounce their name, but it's a weird name. I'm doing my best here. Either way, you check top 5 for a card with Ominagruzio in a name, so either this or his mask form, and add it to your hand. If you whiff, you actually get to Soul Charge 2. So we love that. Since it's only a top 5 check, you will occasionally whiff. It doesn't happen too often, but if you do, you Soul Charge 2, which is good because this deck definitely goes through Soul really fast. So, pretty good skill. Then the Evil Eye Owl on the grade 2. This one is when he is placed from riding specifically on the crow. You get to search your deck for a trigger, throw it right into your soul, and draw a card. So, ripping a trigger out of your deck can seem kind of counterintuitive, and it doesn't necessarily feel the best, but you're feeling the game mechanic that we'll go over, and you also get a draw out of it. So we like that. It's still a pretty good skill. Honestly, if you wanted to run it in the Unica ride line, I personally wouldn't, but I can see the argument for, searching for the crit and putting the crit straight into your soul. But what we're really here to talk about is our boy over here, part 1 of the Ominagruzio pair. The base one, the one that you ride in the ride line. So this one's pretty straightforward. This guy just has 2 skills. He says when he's placed on Vanguard, you just check the top 5 for either Ominagruzio or for the Mask of Hydragum. So that's great. You can either get another copy of him, you can get a copy of the mask version of him, or you can get a copy of the mask itself. So that's all fun. We like that. We love the consistency. This is what I'm talking about where I said this deck feels pretty consistent and one of the more consistent mask decks because you just have a lot of search. So you're searching for Ominagruzio, you can search for Ominagruzio Mask. This searches for potentially Ominagruzio Mask. This searches for the Mask of Hydragum, potentially off the top, plus the other cards that we'll go over later that can also search for the mask itself. So a lot of just really good consistency in this deck, which I always really appreciate. That's our ride line. Now, I know a lot of mask decks don't run a lot of the original grade 3, but in this deck we actually do run max copies of the original, partially for that first skill of being able to ride back on top of it to continue to do the checks, but then we also got that second skill to talk about, which is important and why we potentially re-ride this card sometimes even over the mask, is another axe skill. You Soul Blast 1, choose a trigger from your drop zone, and you bind it. And then for the rest of that turn, your opponent doesn't get defensive power from triggers of that trigger specifically, I should say. So if you Soul Blast 1 and bind a critical trigger, if your opponent damage checks a critical trigger, they won't get that power increase. Same with draws, heals, what have you. Draws and heals effects will still go off, annoyingly enough, but they won't get the power, which is really nice. So at least shuts off some of the RNG from defense triggers, which I'm a huge fan of. But so for max consistency with all the searches that we have, we run 3 extra copies of this. The other reason why is because we got to talk about the main boy, his other half, the Ominagruzio Masque. So we're running 4 copies of this for obvious reasons. This card is really cool. I think a very strong card. It's got 3 things going on. The first one's pretty simple. He can only be ridden on an Ominagruzio, so you can only ride over himself or base boy over here. But really what's important are the next 2 skills. So his second skill is a carbon copy of what all the other Masque grade 3s say, where you remove a Ominagruzio with its different card name, so has to be this one. Remove it from the game, either from the drop hand or soul, and then you get to bind a trigger from your drop zone, and then same thing as the other Ominagruzio, you then get to shut off defensive triggers, but with his skill, unlike the other one, not only does it shut off defensive trigger power, it also reduces the shield of those specific triggers in your bind zone by 5,000 power. So if you have a crit, draw, and heal all bound in your bind zone, any of your opponent's crits, draws, or heals in their hand that they were going to use to guard have minus 5k shield. So very impactful skill, because it really makes guarding hard in this deck, and where you get some pretty good numbers. And when you look into Ominagruzio Masque's third skill, which is a pretty standard restand skill at the end of the battle that he attacked, counterblast 1, put 2 rear guards into the soul, restand him, -1 drive. No discard associated with that, which we like. You just eat 2 rear guards, but even that, as we'll get into when we talk about other units, doesn't really matter. So pretty solid restand skill. Your opponent has minus 5k shield on a lot of their triggers, ideally all of them, by the second time you'd be going into this. So, just really strong. Not much else to say there. It's a restanding vanguard. It turns off defensive power that your opponent will get. It reduces their shield value. It's a very aggressive card that makes it hard for your opponent to stop. And then lastly, for the grade 3s, to shock of no one, we were running 3 copies of the Masque of Hydragum. I was really happy I was able to get the funny one from the BCS promo. So glad I got that. For anyone who doesn't know, the Masque of Hydragum has 2 skills. The first is, it's a normal order technically. Play it from your hand, check top 5 of your deck for either a card with Dragon Tree or Masque in its name, and add to your hand. So you can search for the top 5 for a copy of Ominagruzio Masque and then just add it into your hand. Or you can search for a Dragon Tree unit, which we have one other one that we'll go over in a bit. So again, nice, good consistency bump. Lets you search for the cards that you're missing, particularly the Masque unit himself. But then his second skill is the important one, which is act in the drop zone. You get to put this into your soul, and then take a card with Masque in its name and ride it at stand. And if you didn't Persona Ride that turn, it counts as a Persona Ride. So it's a fun little skip you get to do, where if you're on base Ominagruzio, you play the Masque from your drop zone, goes into your soul, and you can just hop right up onto the grade 3. And then he's just fully online. And then that way, even if you go first, you won't get the Persona Ride, but you'll get this. They'll be able to just go straight in and use the Masque skill, which is very strong. So with that, you're always going to do that. The second you have the opportunity, even, like I said, even if you're going first, you're doing the mask skip up to this. This doesn't have any offensive capabilities, really. All of your pressures is coming from the mask. So, only run 3. I don't feel like you need more than 3 in this deck, since you have multiple ways of searching it. And I haven't really had an issue so far, so I think 3 is perfectly fine. If you really want to feel just safer and run 4, you certainly can, but 3 feels fine to me. Now for the grade 2s, we're running 4 copies of the specific grade 2 for this deck, Misery Winged Dragon. This is a really good card. So, 2 skills, and they're pretty straightforward. The first is just continuous during your turn. He gets 5,000 power for every trigger of a different name in your bind zone. So it does have to be different name, but that can stack up pretty fast. You're usually getting 2 triggers in your bind zone every turn. So by turn 2, ideally you'd have 4 different triggers in your bind zone, so he's getting plus 20,000 power. So he's just 30k beater by himself, and then on Persona Right he's 40 by himself. So really just your main attacker in the deck for just pushing really high numbers. And then his second skill, also very strong, just when he's placed on rear guard, if you have 2 triggers in your bind zone, you get to Soul Blast 2 and draw a card. So it just adds to the advantage, is really strong, beater, and just overall really good card, you know? Gets big and draws a card. Can't really complain about that. Next, we have a card we've alluded to a couple of times, 3 copies of Dragon Tree Wretch Skullcanda. So this is the Dark States version of the Mask of Hydragum searcher that every nation got. When placed on rear guard, counter +1, soul +1. Search your deck for the mask, and just add it right into your hand. And then you also get to put a Dragon Tree marker on a rearguard circle. It doesn't have to be the rearguard circle that he's on. And for anyone who also doesn't know, the Dragon Tree markers just give 5,000 power to the thing that is on it in its rearguard circle if you have a Mass Vanguard. Or Dragon Tree Vanguard, excuse me. So, this pretty straightforward. It just is another avenue to get the mask, and then also put a 5k marker, a mini force marker for those who played V, just on your board permanently. So 3 copies, and again, with all the search in this deck, I don't think haven't felt like I needed 4 of this. If you would like to run 4, you certainly can, but 3 feels fine with how you can search for the mask already. 3 copies of that. And then finally, to round it out, this is kind of your flex spot, and I've been going back and forth on this spot. I've run a couple different things that we'll talk about at the end, but I've landed on Laminia. So this is the cycle generic from set 10 that every nation got. This is the card that says, when discarded during your ride phase, you can Soul Blast 1 and put them on the bottom of the deck to draw a card. So really good in the early game to just build up some early advantage and just make sure you get your pieces, which we like him for that, and that's kind of the main reason we're running this. And then, but the other thing for this deck, which is good, is that on the turn that you Persona Ride, you can call her to rear guard, counterblast 1, choose a card from your soul and call it to rear guard, and if you called, you may soul charge 1. So the soul charge 1 is kind of nice. Late game doesn't super matter, but sometimes you may need a little bit of extra soul. The main thing is calling cards out of your soul, which is incredibly important for the main MVP of the deck, honestly, which is Ruin Collector. So Ruin Collector says, when he's placed on rear guard, you may soul charge 1, which is good. Again, build soul, and this is fun in the early game for a little combo you can do with Laminia and the ride line that I'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, so the reason why this card is considered the MVP of the deck is because of his second skill, which is if he's put into the soul by the effect of your Ominagruzio Vanguard, he counts as 2 units. So really just great for mitigating the cost of the Masque, where he has to technically put 2 rear guards into the soul to restand, this just counts as both. So usually what you'll want to do is you just boost this line for your first attack and then just put this into the soul restand and then keep 2 other columns intact. So just really great card. It makes it so that you're just gaining more advantage from that restand skill and only losing 1 rear guard to basically get 3 drives. So strong card. Definitely run that at 4. And the other non-perfect card grade run that we're running is kind of the other tech slot, which is the Dark States Kitty Cat. I think it's technically referred to as a you're a high beast, purple jewel beast, amethyst, but it's a little kitty cat. It's the Dark States Kitty Cat. So this was the generic for set 12. That every nation got some variation of this. And these ones are interesting, to say the least. All of them say that when this is placed on rearguard or guardian circle, you take 2 cards from your ride line and put them back in the ride deck face up. And if you do that, you either, in this case, if you placed on rearguard, countercharge 1, or if you placed it on guardian circle, get 15,000 shield. So you place it on guardian circle, great, 20k shield. So just like kind of an emergency stopgap if you just need to not die in a turn, it's a 20k shield. Or if you place it on rearguard, it's a just countercharge 1 for free, which is really nice. Now, some of you might be thinking, hey, that cost is put 2 cards from the ride line back into the ride deck, but this is a mass deck where we're going to be removing the grade 3 in the ride line from the game because of the mass skill. So why would you run 2 copies of this when you'd only get it off once? My answer to that is you're right. In any other mask deck, I would only run 1 copy of this because you would only get the skill off once. However, this deck is a little bit of an exception because we are running max copies of the original Ominagruzio. So because of that, a lot of the time you're able to just remove the other copies of this in the main deck because you'll find them with all of the searching that you do, and you won't need to remove the ride line Ominagruzio. Sometimes you will, but a lot of the time you won't, in which case you will just be able to activate the cat potentially twice. Because remember, you're only going to be doing this skill from the mask to remove it, ideally just twice. Because if you're able to just keep cycling between the 2 of them, by turn 4, like I said, you can just have the bind zone have all 4 triggers between their 2 skills. So you theoretically only need to use the removed Ominagruzio from the game twice, which means you'll have extra copies, which means you don't have to use the ride line. So because of that, you can get away with running 2 copies of the Kit Kat. You're probably only going to end up using it once per game anyway, because you're only running 2. You're probably not going to see both of them. And like I said, you may have to end up using the ride line grade 3 if you just don't see the other ones. But it's nice just to have the emergency countercharge or the 20k shield, just because there's not a whole lot of counterblast, but between Laminia and Ominagruzio Masque, if someone damage denies you, it might come in clutch. But also really the 20k shield is the main thing of like why I wanted 2 of these. If you wanted to cut it down to 1, run something else, you certainly can. I wouldn't really argue that hard about it, but I think 2 of these is perfectly acceptable in this deck. And then lastly, your standard 3 Nation Perfect Guards, 1 Elementaria Sanctitude. Nation Perfect Guards, you don't have to discard to Perfect Guard if you have 1 or less cards in hand. Sanctitude, don't have to discard a card to Perfect Guard if your opponent has the text Triple Drive. And then also gets around Guard Restrict from hand, Guard Restrict specifically, because you're not guarding from hand technically this goes to the Order Zone. So, not much else to say there. So one of the other fun parts about this deck is the trigger lineup, where because we want 4 different triggers in the bind zone, that means we want to run rainbow, so it allows us to do some fun things with the lineup. So for me personally, I'm doing 6 critical triggers because this is a restanding Vanguard deck, so we want to check crits. So we're still running majority crits. For that reason, I am running for the effect crit, just because, again, Soul can kind of get a little tight in this deck. So having some emergency go to Soul is kind of nice. It doesn't really come up that often, so if you don't have them or rather would just run generics, feel free. But I'm doing 6, and then, yeah, just 2 generics of whatever you want to run. But definitely majority crits, because restanding Vanguard wants to check critical triggers. But then next, we're doing 3 front triggers and 2 draw triggers. So the reason why I broke it down like this, and I went back and forth a lot, honestly, but I wanted a little bit more fronts in this deck for the aggression piece, and also 20k shield is nice. But really for the aggression piece, and also because this deck has a good amount of draw power already between Laminia in the early game, with all your searches just adding cards to your hand, Misery Ring drawing just plussing straight to your hand. You really don't need more draw triggers than this. And so we only run 2, and also draws, one of these will almost always be the trigger I search for the grade 2 ride line that just takes a trigger card from your deck and puts into your soul. Almost always going to be the draw, unless I know that my opponent's not running draws, in which case then it would be a front. But 3-2, you don't really need the draw power. I'd recommend only doing max 2 draws and then running either more fronts or more crits. But this is the ratio I like so far, and it's working out pretty well for me. Now for the heals, I'm running 2 generics and then 1 each of the crit and restand effect heals. Again, I've talked about this before on this channel. It's a meta call and kind of your own personal preference. Set 12 is interesting. You got a good amount of restand back around here with Bastion, with this deck, honestly. But you still have like Gendiva and Willista. They haven't been hit here on the English side yet, so I like having 1 each just to kind of cover my bases there. But then also just having 15k shields is nice. So 4 of those. Lastly, I am running the Dark States Overture. Now, here's the thing. I know the red and blue OT are good, but this is a Dark States deck with a restanding Vanguard. If you are a Dark States deck with a restanding Vanguard, you should be playing this. The reason why, for anyone who doesn't know, is when you offensively check the Dark States over trigger, for the rest of the game, not just that turn, the rest of the game, your Vanguard gets 10,000 power and a crit. So that means every time this boy swings, he is going to have plus 10,000 power and an extra crit for both attacks. So like this greed on there's another, I think there's definitely another restanding Dark States deck, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. But either way, this is a restanding Vanguard. You want to run something that's going to give your Vanguard just an extra crit for the rest of the game. Like, you really can't argue with that in a restanding Vanguard deck. So I run the Dark States. If I wasn't going to run the Dark States, I'd probably run the blue OT for the extra crit. And getting a card back from the drop zone can be clutch sometimes, so it'd probably be blue OT. But we really should run this. Now, a couple of things. One, I wanted to just kind of talk about a fun little thing you can do with Laminia, the Ride Line Grade 1, and Ruin Collector. So immediately, like, first thought, you might be a little gun shy to use Laminia. on your first discard for the ride line because you're going up into this, and this requires a soul to use its skill. And that's true. And if you don't have Ruin Collector, you shouldn't do that. But remember that the Crow is an act. So you can discard Laminia, go up into the Crow, Soul Blast 1, use her skill, but then before using Crow, throw down Ruin Collector, usually behind him, and he just immediately Soul Charges 1, and you can use his skill. So it allows you to plus just 2 to your hand, basically, right away, for the cost of 1 Soul Blast that you just then get back. And then you also then have a 16k line that's a lot harder to stop. So that's a combo I just really like immediately doing on turn 1, and why I think Laminia still works very well in the deck, despite having some constraints on the soul. Now, with that said, like I mentioned earlier, there were some other cards that I was going to use and was running for a while, and that was the set 11 generic for Dark States. So I actually was originally running this over Laminia, because this card, just really quick, says if you Soul Blast 1 when she's placed, if you played in normal order, aka if you played the Mask, check top 5, call a card to rearguard. So really good for just like searching for a Ruin Collector and just calling it to the board if you didn't have it. And then a second skill was Soul Blast 3 on attack, get 5k, draw a card. So more draw power, but then the Soul Blast 3 is just pretty heavy in a deck that already Soul Blasted a lot, so a lot of the time that skill just wasn't coming up. And the Soul Blast 1 to look for the top was whiffing more than it was helping me. So I was going back and forth between her and Laminia, but ultimately I found Laminia to just be a little more consistently helpful, because she can always just, like we talked about, get Ruin Collector just back out of the soul every turn with her skill, assuming you Persona Ride, which you're almost certainly going to be doing in this deck. So if you want to try and run like both of them, run less of the Dark States Cat, run like 2 of this, you can do that for sure. I just wanted to run some more grade 1s because there's no real grade 1s in this deck, and there's already a lot of grade 2s. You could also try Clean Sweep Dragon is another great card. For everyone who doesn't know, if you Persona Road, act, Counterblast 1, choose 3 of any player's rear guards, put them into their respective soul, he gets 5k for each card put. Really good for sniping your opponent's rear guards and just putting them in a place that they usually cannot get back. I know some people like in this deck, and that's definitely not a bad call with Clean Sweep. My only problem with Clean Sweep right now in this deck in particular, 1 is the Counterblast, and 2, also a little bit of a meta call, where right now there's just a lot of the good decks have resist, looking mainly at Bastion, and we're just not going to be able to touch that front row anyway. Some other things I'd rather just run instead. So, but certainly a solid option. I don't disagree per se. I just prefer the cards that I'm running. But those are some additional options if you want to play around with. But like I said at the beginning, I'm having a lot of fun with this deck. It's, in my opinion, the consistent mass deck. And then we're getting the pretty cool grade 2 in set 13. That'll just help accelerate even more. I'm hoping this deck still gets supported going into the future, though I don't have super high hopes for that, since it looks like we're getting something of a soft reboot going forward in the anime. But who knows, maybe they'll still throw some cards here and there to this deck, or at least to the mass decks in Dark States in general, since there are quite a few. But yeah, that's pretty much everything I have to say about this deck. If you have any questions, shoot them in the comments, and otherwise you'll be hearing from us soon. Thanks.